Hello everyone, my name is Eric Masowski, and in this tutorial we're going to be continuing the organic modeling series by generating a bump map from our color map, or at least the beginnings of creating our bump map. Okay, so if you've been working with this series, you should have a nice high resolution color map that you've generated yourself. If not, I have included what you see here on the screen, but at a slightly lower resolution to keep the file size down. So I highly recommend that you build up a nice high resolution color map because you're going to end up getting a lot more information out of it, such as the pores around the lips, the chin, and the sideburns. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to first turn this into a regular layer by holding down Alt on the keyboard and double clicking on the background layer. We're now going to create a new layer and drag it beneath our color layer. Now what this is going to be is this is going to be kind of like our reference area. And so we want this to be a nice neutral gray color. So if we click on our color swatch and set our brightness with the B to 50, or we can explicitly set our RGB to 128. So this gives us a nice mid-tone gray. We can now go up to Edit, Fill, make sure it's set to foreground color, and click OK. Alright, now often when I'm doing this sort of work, I usually like to make a copy of my color map just in case if things go drastically wrong. So if we select our color layer, click and drag it onto our Create Layer button, that'll create a clone. We can now rename one of our layers and hide it for later use. Okay, now a really quick way to get bump information from a color map is to use something called the high pass filter. Now before we can use a high pass filter, we're going to go up to Image, Adjustments, Desaturate. And what this does is this removes all the color information from our image. We're now going to go up to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and just make sure that this first tab is right at the edge of our histogram here, and the one on the left are the dark values. It's over to the left. And so we do this to make sure that we get a nice representation of all our values in the image. Click OK. And we're now going to go up to Filter, Other, High Pass. Now you'll see that if we move this little preview around to, say, the mouth area, you can see what happens is it gets rid of a lot of the shading information and just brings out the highlights and the shadows. So this is a great first step for this sort of stuff. And so we're just going to set a value of about 2, 2.1, whatever it looks like your bump map needs. You don't want too much detail or too much of the shading information to come through. You really only want the really important parts. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Alright, so we just click OK. And you'll notice that all around the perimeter of our head texture, we have kind of like this embossing effect. Now that is something that we're going to have to get rid of. But to see why, let's go ahead and File, Save. We're going to jump into Max, create a really quick bitmap, go to Head, or a really quick bump map, go through. Okay, we have it here. And we're going to do a quick render. Okay, so you'll notice right around the chin, we're getting some nice little divots around the forehead. It's starting to look like skin. But right here around the ears, you'll notice that we got this hard angle or this hard crease. And that's because of this embossing effect. If we look around the image, we'll see that we also get it at the top of the head here, as well as some other parts around. So, what we're going to do is we're going to jump back into Photoshop and clean that information up. Now, since we're dealing with very high frequency information, meaning a lot of little details, we can often deal with this fairly quickly and don't have to worry about lining things up as much. So if we select our clone tool, hold down Alt to choose our source, and then just start painting away the seam. And so we just do this for all of these areas that have this embossing effect on it, including the area right around the ears. Now the area around the ears is going to require a little bit more finesse and a little bit more time because the hair overlaps that seam. But let's jump ahead to where we have these seams all cleaned up. Okay, so here we go. We just cleaned up many of the areas. Now, if you're going to be making an image or whatever that's going to be so close where people are going to be able to determine whether a hair consistently goes from one side of our UV map to the other, I highly recommend you start looking into other methods for doing your hair, such as hair generators or using quad strips with hair textures applied to them, instead of relying on a bump map for the hair effect. Okay, so once we have this, we're going to save it again, jump over into Max, and do a quick render. And there we go, it's looking a lot better now. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to take a look at is what happens when we're actually in very close. So let's just say really close right here by the chin. If we render this out, our bump map looks pretty ugly. Because what we need here is we need two things. First, we need to make our painted bump map a little bit subtler, but we also need some additional bump information to give the illusion of skin. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create a copy of this for reference, and we can easily handle this effect by merging or blending our painted bump map with some procedural noise. So if we click on our bitmap, go up to Mix, keep old map as submap, and in the empty channel for color 2, we add a noise. Now because it's skin, we want something a little bit more random and rough, so we choose fractal underneath noise parameters. We drop our size way down to about as small as we can get it, just about. Now if we jump back up a level to our mix map, and we set our mix amount to 100%, this will give us only the noise map will contribute to the output. So if we now render, we can see what the noise map contributes. Now this is looking better, but it's still a little bit big, so we're going to drop back down into our noise map. We're going to set the tiling to 3 for the X and the Y. Back up, render it out, much finer detail. We could even get in much closer if we wanted. So you still get a lot of little details in there. So this is great. Alright, So now what we need to do is we just need to figure out the mix amount that is the perfect blend between our head bitmap, our head bump map, and the procedural noise. So often when doing this, I usually start off at 50 just to see where both of them are. And so that's not too bad. Gonna bump it up a little bit more. And we'll just leave it at that. Okay, now say for instance, this little pimple right here doesn't really seem to have a lot of depth. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump back into Photoshop, and remember that the black values or the dark values recede into the surface, the highlights come out of the surface. So if we zoom into our chin area here, take a look at our color map again real quick. You can see our little pimple there. And if we bring back our bump map, switch to our brush tool, choose a nice white color, set our mode to lighten, and then just start painting or bringing that part out a little bit. Now you can always do that on a separate layer to avoid any destruction of the existing bump map. We're going to save it, jump over into Max, render it out, and pay attention to the little pimple to see if it's, yep, it's a little bit better there. So let's just compare this with what we had before. So this was just the straight bump map applied. Here we have a nice combination of the two. So we get a lot of very, very fine grained noise in there. We have a little bit more detail for, or a little bit more protrusion for the pimple, and we have a nice subtle bump effect. Okay, now you can always go back and forth between Photoshop and just start laying down additional lines. So this is extremely rough, and you probably want to do a little bit of a better job if you're doing this yourself. But just as an example, I mean, you can just start painting the areas that you're interested in. So start bringing certain areas down and other areas out of the surface. Often blur it up a little bit. So just save it and jump back into Max, do a quick render, and so we see a couple of very, very subtle changes. And so you can just jump back and forth until you find something that you're happy with. Okay, so that'll basically do it for this tutorial. In future ones, we'll take a look at how we can actually isolate where the specular highlights show up, because certain parts of the head are oilier than others and thus more or less shiny. And so we'll look at how we can paint that sort of map, and we'll also look into some additional details in setting up the shader or skin shader for our character here. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or post on the forums. Thanks for watching.